Constantine's actions represented the wounding of the beast by the sword, and John Paul II's reign represented the healing of that wound. We have also pointed out that the 1986 Assisi prayer meeting is loaded with apocalyptic significance. It was a world historic prayer meeting of idolatry. It was the most notorious event of the Great Apostasy. It was a huge sign that pagan Europe and the beast had returned. In fact, as was mentioned earlier, the altar where the idolatry was conducted was dedicated to the name Peace, corresponding precisely to the Ara Pacis, the pagan altar of peace in the pagan Roman Empire. Keep that in mind. Now consider this. The historic transformation of the pagan Roman Empire into a Christian one, that is, the wounding of the beast, began with Constantine and his famous victory over Maxentius at the Milvian Bridge in 312. This was one of the most important events in human and Christian history. On the eve of this battle, Constantine received a vision in which he saw the sign of Christ and the cross and the words, "In this sign you will conquer." Later on that day, Constantine received another vision in which Jesus Christ instructed him to use his sign in battle. Pay special attention to the date.
On October 27th, they were poised to invade the city of Rome.
Constantine camped here, 9 miles north of Rome. His army was outnumbered 4-1. So he prayed to God for help. And here in this field, he had a vision that changed the course of history.
Around noon, Constantine looked up at the sky and saw a sign above the sun. The symbol was a cross formed by the Greek letters chi and rho, the first 2 letters in the name of Christ. Above the sign were the words, "Conquer by this." That night, the strange sign appeared again. Constantine said that in his sleep, the Christ of God appeared to him and instructed him to use the sign as a standard in battle.
Constantine received the sign in which he would conquer the pagan Roman beast on October 27th in the year 312. On the same day, Jesus Christ appeared to him. Well, the Assisi event in 1986, the most notorious event of the Great Apostasy, the means by which the followers of the counter-church are implicated in mortal sin, and a huge sign of the return of pagan Europe, occurred on October 27th of 1986. It's not just a coincidence. As the sign in which the beast would be wounded and conquered appeared to Constantine on October 27th in 312, the sign that the beast had spiritually recovered from that wound was visible on October 27th, 1986 with the Assisi event. And as we said, Constantine's actions represented the wounding of the beast, and John Paul II's reign represented the healing of that wound. That's why John Paul II himself was wounded and recovered. He is the image of the beast. This also provides further support for the conclusion that John Paul II was the Antichrist, and that the world historic 1986 Assisi event is what is described in 2 Thessalonians 2, as we covered in detail in our video, The Antichrist Identified. 2 Thessalonians 2 prophesies that the man of sin, the Antichrist, comes in connection with the Great Apostasy. It describes him as the one reclining across from and raising himself above every so-called god or object of worship. That fits precisely with Assisi, during which John Paul II, the sixth king, the one who was wounded, the one who had his image honored, etc., was raised above and seated across from every so-called god or object of worship at a world historic event of idolatry. As we point out in the video, The Antichrist Identified, the verse could be translated as the one reclining across from, a more literal translation, or the one opposing, a strictly speaking metaphorical translation. However, the metaphorical translation, that the man of sin opposes every so-called god, even though the underlying verb is used metaphorically in various other passages of the New Testament, doesn't make the most sense in this passage. For why would the man of sin oppose the worship of false gods? Satan's kingdom is not divided. Satan organizes the worship of idols, and thus it would make sense that the man of sin would support idols and false gods. Hence, the literal sense and the literal translation in which the man of sin positionally is reclining across from and raising himself above every so-called god or object of worship at a huge event that reveals/signals the Great Apostasy makes more sense. That corresponds precisely to what happened with John Paul II at Assisi on October 27, 1986. During the event, the various false religious leaders conducted their worship below where John Paul II was seated. They offered their idolatrous worship toward their idols and false gods. Hence, John Paul II was literally reclining across from and raised above the various idols and so-called gods being worshipped. That event, the most notorious incident in the Great Apostasy, was the sign that the beast, pagan Europe, had returned spiritually. There were other signs of the beast rising, of course, such as when John Paul II in his first homily denied that Jesus is the Christ, in direct fulfillment of Scripture's definition of the Antichrist, when he declared that man is the Christ of Matthew 16, but Assisi was the most notorious sign for people in general that paganism had returned to Europe, and that what Constantine wounded had recovered. Now, when receiving the sign on October 27th in 312, Christ told Constantine to use the sign in battle. Likewise, on October 27, 1986, the Antichrist, John Paul II, tells pagan Europe that Assisi is a sign and that humanity should follow its path. In fact, as mentioned previously, according to a common view of what happened, the sign of October 27, 312 was seen twice on that day, once early in the day and once later. Well, on October 27, 1986, earlier in the day, during his remarks that welcomed the representatives of the different religions, John Paul II said this, quote, "I see this gathering today as a very significant sign." Then later in the day, during his closing remarks, he said, quote, "The very fact that we have come to Assisi from various quarters of the world is in itself a sign of this common path which humanity is called to tread." End quote. Assisi is the sign in which the Antichrist spiritually conquers because it's the symbol of the apostasy and indifferentism of the Vatican II sect. It's not the only one, but it's the most notorious one. It's the one that most quickly implicates people in sin when they honor Antipope John Paul II as a saint or follow the new religion.
Pope St. John Paul II.
Pope St. John Paul the Great.
St. John Paul.
St. John Paul.
I'm not questioning his personal holiness.
St. John Paul II.
Of course, St. John Paul II.
It's a term given to these teachings of St. John Paul the Great.
It's Jason Everett, author of St. John Paul the Great.
Pope St. John Paul II.
Thus, the Antichrist spiritually conquers almost all of Christian Europe and the followers of the counterchurch by the standard of Assisi, just as Christ wounded the beast with the standard of the cross. At Assisi, and through his other teachings and actions, John Paul II organized and supported the worship of idols. Hence, when people who are familiar with what he did call him holy or a saint, they are by implication calling the idols and the false gods that he served holy. That's why the honor given to his image by followers of the counterchurch is mentioned in the Apocalypse as a means by which people are damned. It's also very interesting that on February 24, 2002, a month after the second Assisi event, John Paul II issued a Decalogue or a Ten Commandments of Assisi to all the heads of state of the world. Well, God is the one who issues the Ten Commandments. John Paul II's attempt to issue a Decalogue is another example of how he purported to be God, which was most clear in his repeated teaching that every man is Jesus Christ, as is covered in our video, quote, St. John Paul II Exposed. Moreover, 2 Thessalonians 2:4 tells us that the man of sin seats himself in the temple of God, displaying that he is God. That fits with John Paul II sitting in St. Peter's Basilica and the Vatican. It is the temple of God. Pope Pius XI even called St. Peter's Basilica a most ample temple, and many prophecies have been fulfilled right there. The participle that is translated displaying that he is God or showing himself to be God means to set something forth, and it often has the signification of setting something forth in a formal or official manner. That also precisely fits John Paul II because he formally or officially set forth that he is God in encyclicals and speeches by teaching that every man is the Son of God, as our material proves. Furthermore, on March 24, 2000, John Paul II appeared in Israel in a chair with a large inverted cross over his head, a satanic symbol. As Christ was on the cross in Israel, it makes sense that the Antichrist would be seen under an inverted cross in Israel. Our video Apocalypse Now in the Vatican also explains how the successor of Antipope John Paul II, that is, Antipope Benedict XVI, was involved in starting the process by which his image would be venerated, similar to what happened in the pagan Roman Empire. It also discusses Francis and his role. To be saved and free of the Vatican II apostasy, one must be a traditional Catholic. Our material explains how to do that. Although almost the entire world has been conquered by sin, unbelief, or the end times counterchurch, the true Catholic Church has not been conquered. It still exists in a faithful remnant, and it cannot be overcome.